Is it possible that Northern Europeans were not only sailing ships in the Bronze Age 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, but that some of these ships could be enormous vessels, 30 metres or 100 feet long? I've been fascinated by the Nordic Bronze Age for a long time. This was southern Scandinavia during the period from about 1800 to 500 BC. The early part of this era was when the ancient civilizations of the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean were reaching their peak in power and wealth. And one would think that Scandinavia, so far away up in the far north, was completely unconnected and impoverished. But that's certainly not the case. While the Mycenaeans and Minoans were thriving in the south, the people of the Nordic Bronze Age also built a wealthy society fully integrated into the international trade network. Their most important resource was precious amber, much prized by those Bronze Age civilizations to the south, from Central Europe all the way to Egypt. And in return, they imported precious commodities like wool, gold, and the copper and tin they needed to make bronze. There was no easily accessible source of copper in the region, and so they relied completely on imports to create the thousands of tools and weapons they needed for their society to function. This trade was carried out using horses and ox-drawn wagons, but most of all by boats, voyaging through Europe's navigable rivers and through the treacherous waters of the Baltic, the North Sea, and even the Atlantic coast. We know they made journeys like this because of the types of tools and weapons they imported, and because the chemical composition of the copper they made their own artifacts from can be traced to specific origins around Europe. For as long as I've been reading about these people, I believed they undertook these journeys in boats powered by teams of paddlers. This is what is depicted in over 20,000 boat images carved into the rocks in coastal regions in this era. Their practice of creating rock art tells us so much about this ancient society, about their beliefs and social and religious practices, and about their activities from rituals to warfare. The boat images, long vessels with curving prows powered by men with paddles, are the most common motif, showing how important they were to these people. Incredibly, we know that the designs depicted reflect reality, because about 100 years ago, the remains of a boat just like this were discovered in a bog in southern Denmark. That boat also contained a large shipment of weapons and armour. We know then that they were capable vessels, able to carry a large crew and cargo. Still though, it seemed quite incredible to me that they could be paddled not just to Britain and around the North Sea, but all the way along the Atlantic coast to northern Spain. They seem to have made astonishing epic journeys powered entirely by the stroke of the paddle and the movements of the tide and currents. And I thought surely they must have taken months or even years to complete these round trips. But a new study, published in 2024, has completely changed this view. The study authors present evidence suggesting Nordic Bronze Age mariners were sailing ships, complete with masts, rigging and sails, by at least 1550 BC. That's over 3,500 years ago. Not only that, by their calculations, some of these vessels could be enormous, perhaps 30 or even 40 metres long. That's 130 feet. They were crewed by dozens of sailors. These incredible seagoing craft remind me of the huge Viking longships that were sailed 2,000 years later. Suddenly, these epic prehistoric journeys don't seem so implausible after all. So let's look at the evidence for these huge sailing ships from Bronze Age Northern Europe. This is the story of impressive ships and epic voyages in the Nordic Bronze Age. Understanding prehistoric boat technology is pretty challenging, considering how rare it is for any boats to survive for thousands of years. Almost every ancient boat that has ever existed has rotted away into nothing. Just think about how unlikely it is for us to find anything organic from thousands of years ago. The ancient boat has to sink through accident or design, and then sit in anaerobic conditions beneath the seafloor, riverbed, or in a boggy wetland. Then it has to survive being destroyed through dredging and natural or man-made ecological changes, like draining wetlands for farmland, for example. And then people have to dig or dive in exactly the right place to find it. It's a miracle we have any ancient wood at all, really. We know that people were using watercraft even hundreds of thousands of years ago because our Paleolithic ancestors reached islands that were only accessible by crossing the sea. But the oldest surviving boat in the world is a dugout canoe from about 8000 BC. Made by hollowing out a single pine trunk, it was discovered by chance in the Netherlands in the 1950s during road building. It had been sunk into a peat bog, which preserved it for almost 10,000 years. Logboats like this were likely used by Mesolithic Europeans to reach every part of the coastline and every island beyond. They even paddled these things through the rough and cold northern seas to the Hebrides to hunt and to harvest hazelnuts. It's also assumed that they, or the later Neolithic people, built skin boats constructed by stretching hides over wooden frames. But these materials are even less likely to survive to the present than solid wood. By the Bronze Age in Northern Europe, we start to see evidence for a new boat-building technology, the plank-built boat. These were made with individual planks joined together with withes or sewn with thread. The inside was then strengthened with beams or frames, and the whole thing was caulked to make it watertight. This made for sturdy and seaworthy vessels that could be made in a variety of forms, from broad and shallow to long and narrow. There are surviving examples from Britain dating back to around 2000 BC. The Ferriby boats from Yorkshire might have travelled England's east coast and even perhaps crossed the North Sea, and the Dover boat from the south coast could have crossed the English Channel. After 2000 BC, Britain was increasingly involved in overseas trade networks, especially exporting copper from our many copper mines. To learn all about that, please watch my video on the incredible Great Orme mine. And there's evidence of this trade in the form of shipwrecks on the seafloor along the Irish Sea, English Channel and North Sea coasts. While the ships themselves don't survive, their cargoes of bronze artefacts on the seafloor show where they sank. And the societies of southern Scandinavia during this period had to import all their metal as they had no mines of their own. They needed to import tons of copper every year to maintain their way of life, which means perhaps 10 to 20 boatloads bringing raw tin and copper from the west alone every year. They may even have travelled as far as Brittany and beyond, down the coast of France to northern Spain. They had productive tin and copper mines there, and evidence of links with Scandinavia is seen in the similar styles of contemporary rock art depicted on the coasts of both regions. Links are also shown by Scandinavian amber finds in Galicia, Galician bronze axes found in Sweden, and Nordic bronze shields made from Spanish copper. The need for all this copper likely drove boat-building technologies towards ever larger and more seaworthy vessels, and the increasing wealth of the Nordic Bronze Age chieftains engaging in trade enabled this development to take place. We don't have the remains of ships from the height of this era, but we do have a later, smaller vessel known as the Hjortspring boat. Dating to the 4th century BC, this Iron Age vessel reflects some of the building methods and designs of the Bronze Age boats. Found on a Danish island over a century ago, it tells us so much about prehistoric boat building techniques. At 19 metres long by 2 metres wide, it likely had a crew of about 20 paddlers. When it was sank, it contained a cargo of 131 shields, 33 shield bosses, 138 iron spearheads, 11 swords, mail armour and more. It was likely deliberately sunk into the bog as a votive offering to the gods, a very ancient practice in Europe. Reconstructions of the vessel have shown it to be a very capable watercraft. And it shows us that the over 20,000 boat images tapped into the coastal rocks of southern Scandinavia do accurately represent the designs of real vessels. Analysing these petroglyphs then, as well as boat designs in graves and on metal artefacts and ship-sized monuments on land, will therefore tell us about the designs and sizes of Bronze Age boats and even their enormous seafaring ships. Out of all the tens of thousands of petroglyphs of southern Scandinavia, the boat motif is the most common. It was the most important object to these coastal people for over 1,000 years. Through painstaking analysis of typologies in the depictions of artefacts and in changing styles, chronologies have been established for dating this artwork. Incredible work has also been done comparing the heights of the petroglyphs to ancient sea levels, which changed over the centuries and millennia as the Scandinavian landmass continues to rise due to post-glacial rebound. All this enables a dating precision of up to 200 years in some cases. Now, these images are made by tapping or grinding stones onto the flat surfaces of boulders, so there's only so much detail they can show. And yet, they are absolutely bursting with information about the past. A common form is the double horn projections at the prow and stern, also seen on the Hjortspring boat. These help it to cut through the water, and the upper horn projections also form part of a rail that runs around the upper side of the boat, designed to deflect waves away from the inside of the boat. Some designs show the upper horns extending upwards and even curling back around. These remind me of the high prows of the even sturdier Viking ships of the early medieval era. Some boats show steering oars either at the stern, prow or both. These served like rudders to steer the vessel. The horn projections would have provided the structure for fixing and operating these steering oars. As well as the structure and design of the vessels, the motifs often show the paddlers crewing the boats. These are commonly shown as simple lines, but can also be more detailed human-shaped figures. Some depictions show pairs of paddlers, others even hold up their paddles in the air. And calculating how much space a man needed, and then counting the number of paddlers in images, can provide estimates for the length of boat required to hold them in the real world. So for example, if you count 18 crew marks, that would make 36 paddlers, plus perhaps 2 more to man the steering oars for a total crew of 38, making for an estimated boat length of about 25 metres or 82 feet. Analysing many crude ship depictions suggests there were 2 broad size categories of boats in use in the Nordic Bronze Age. The smaller type of boats were between 4 to 9 metres long, and the larger type were boats between 20 to 40 metres. Of course, this only gives us the length of the vessels, not the width. To understand that dimension, researchers look at the incredible monuments known as stone ships or ship settings. There are hundreds of these monuments, constructed in the region between about 1000 BC and 1000 AD. They were made by erecting stones, sometimes enormous ones, into the shapes of ships. These were often related to burials or cremations, and were likely used for rites to do with burials and honouring the ancestors, and also for community gatherings. After all, the dead, the ancestors, were still a part of the community. Anyway, these monuments are a range of sizes, but most are broadly ship-sized, and their dimensions, the ratio of length to width, are also consistently realistic, all but the very largest likely reflecting real ship sizes. Using the dimensions of the ship settings and later Viking-era ships, they can calculate the overall sizes of contemporary Bronze Age vessels. And some of these ship settings also had a stone or mound or a post hole in the place where a real ship's mast would have been. And Bronze Age rock art depictions throughout the region also show masts, sails, yards and rigging on many different boat types. These date back to as early as perhaps 1800 BC. Incredibly, there's also a piece of wood depicting a ship with a sail that we know was carved into the living tree in 1550 BC, before being preserved in a bog in Denmark. This provides very secure dating for the existence of masts and sails. These ships were likely single-masted, with the mast midships or slightly forward, supported by rigging, and a yard with a large square sail. These would also have been powered by paddlers. So how big could these ships get, really? Well, from the boat building technology side, they calculate that boats of 20 to 30 metres from stem to stern, not including the horn projections, were possible and even common. And the largest of the Bronze Age ship monuments dating to as early as 1000 BC might plausibly reflect the size and design of real boats. Something like this, though, at 40 metres must have been a rarity, requiring the kind of genius boat builder that comes around no more than once in a generation, along with a chieftain or king rich enough to fund such a vessel and the epic voyages it would have carried out. Large ships would have sailed the Baltic, the North Sea and the Atlantic coasts, perhaps all the way to Spain. But I think I should mention there's no evidence at all they ever went further than that. Every time I mention the Bronze Age copper trade on my channel, I see comments asserting that there was a prehistoric transatlantic copper trade. I'm afraid there is no evidence of that at all, despite what some claim online. The copper that was extracted in ancient North America was used by the people who extracted it and those they traded with in North America. If you want to learn all about that, please watch the video on the old copper culture on the Ancient Americas channel. I'll link it in the description below. These ancient Nordic watercraft were incredible vessels, whether they were the size of the Hjortspring boat or masted ships with enormous crews, but I doubt they were even strong enough to make two-way transatlantic voyages, and again, there is no evidence for this at all. We know from testing metal artefacts where the Nordic Bronze Age societies got their metal, and it was Britain, Spain, Central Europe and the Mediterranean. These are well-evidenced, well-established trade routes. But as the international trade routes declined after about 1200 BC, there may also have been a decline in the number of great chiefs able to fund massive vessels. The Nordic region was long thought to have lacked knowledge of the sail until it was introduced in the 7th or 8th century AD, which then gave birth to the Viking era. If this paper is right, perhaps this was not the case. But I wonder if they did exist, that the number of sailing ships dwindled during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age before being revived again. Either way, it's incredible to me that they might have had sailing ships here by 1500 or even 1800 BC. So incredible, in fact, that I am still rather sceptical, to be honest. I understand the argument that they must use circumstantial evidence because of how unlikely it is that any ship remains would survive to be found, but I'd still like to see more hard evidence for their existence. And as almost all the boat images we have do not depict masts and sails, if these ships existed then they must surely have been rare. Either way though, we know from the Hjortspring boat and from the many surviving Bronze Age log boats from Northern and Western Europe that boat building technology helped enable the long-range trade and social networks of the Bronze Age. Like many people before me, I've perhaps been guilty of a pro-Mediterranean bias against the Northern barbarians, because their great buildings were made of wood rather than stone, and there are no magnificent ruins left to marvel over. But they did leave artefacts as beautiful and impressive as any to be found in the world, using materials imported from afar, paid for by exporting amber and perhaps slaves. In the Mediterranean, it's possible that the mariners of the early Cycladic civilization were using paddle power to get about between their islands in 3000 BC. But by the emergence of the Minoan civilization after about 2000 BC, sails were in widespread use in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. If you'd like to see a video about sailing ships in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, please hit like on this video and let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, the sources are listed in the description. Thank you very much to my patrons and channel members. By supporting the channel, you get exclusive content and ad-free videos. The links to join us are in the description below. Now, please watch this video on another no less interesting part of the Nordic Bronze Age, the astonishing frequency of phallic imagery and what it can tell us about this fascinating society. Thank you for watching.